How would you like to level up your EQ game? My name is Andrew Aurora, and I help artists, producers, and mixers bring their creative vision to life through mixing and mastering. And I put out a video like this every single week, so if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit that notifications bell so that way you never miss a video. And today I'm going to be talking about 34 EQ and frequency tips to help you on your mixing and mastering journey. So let's jump right in. Starting with number one, we have the EQ basics. So I recommend when you're learning how to EQ to start off with a flat EQ and experiment with subtle and aggressive EQ adjustments. I recommend notching out the frequencies that you don't like and boosting the pleasant frequencies that you do like, and don't be afraid to boost or to cut too much. Just try not to go overboard. Over time you will get an idea and a feel for how much is too much and how much is too little, but this all comes with practice. Number two is understanding the frequency ranges of different instruments. So basses, kicks, and subdrops tend to rock the low end frequency. Guitars, vocals, synths, keys, these instruments tend to rock the mids or upper mid frequencies, and things like cymbals and hi-hats tend to rock the high end frequencies. Finding a balance and carving out space for each of these instruments is really what mixing is about, and it is necessary for you to have a good mix. Number three is notch filtering. Notch filtering is used to get rid of very specific frequencies and tends to be used to get rid of things like feedback, resonant peaks, and frequencies that just pop out too much. Notch filtering is also sometimes referred to as surgical EQ because it tends to do surgery on your mix. Next, at number four, we have parametric EQs. Now, if you aren't familiar with parametric EQs, you've actually probably seen them at some point. In fact, some DAWs actually come with them on every single channel, such as Logic and Cubase. Parametric EQs are pretty much just like a digital-based EQ where you can actually see kind of a graph and a visual image of the frequencies. Pretty much all parametric EQs offer multiple bands and more flexibility than a graphic or a vintage EQ. And this is why I tend to use parametric EQs pretty often when I mix, and I recommend that you do too.
Now real quick, I wanted to interrupt this video to mention my free resource, The Essentials Guide to Becoming a Beast at Mixing and Mastering. This free resource includes a step-by-step mixing guide, a list of what I feel are the most important things for you to focus on to become a beast at mixing and mastering, my favorite mixing and mastering tips, and my favorite resources such as my favorite books and favorite ear training programs to help you develop a strong foundation for yourself on your mixing and mastering journey. And if you want to pick this up, you can do so by clicking the link in the description of this video. And of course, if you'd like a chance to work with me, there's also a link in the description to apply to work with me as well. Now on to the rest of the video.
Next, at number five, we have filters. So filters are absolutely essential when you mix. There are going to be lots of times that you're going to be using them throughout your mixing career. And using high cut and low cut filters are how you're going to clean up a lot of those unnecessary frequencies that are going to provide you a lot more headroom and a lot more space within your mix. Next, at number six, we have shelf EQs. So shelf EQs are used to boost or cut frequencies in the high or low end spectrum of the frequency range. And they basically boost or cut everything past a set point on the frequency spectrum. These EQ moves are also less likely to cause big phase changes, which means they can be less destructive than low cut or high cut filters. Experiment with shelves and see if you like them better than your high cut or your low cut filters, but I still recommend that you use both. Next, at number seven, we have Q factor. So how wide or how narrow your Q is can drastically affect the sound of your EQ moves. Narrow EQ moves tend to sound less natural and tend to be more noticeable when boosted, but they work great for cutting out specific frequencies that you don't want. Wide EQ moves tend to sound more natural but make a bigger change to the overall frequency spectrum that you're boosting or cutting. However, even though wide EQ moves tend to sound better when boosting and narrow EQ moves tend to sound better when cutting, this is not always the case. For example, I may do a wide EQ boost on the top end of a guitar or a vocal if I want to give it a little bit more air, but I also might do a wide Q cut if I want to have overall less low end or high end in a certain element of my mix. Another example of this is a lot of the time I do wide EQ moves when I'm cutting the mid-range out of my drums, such as my toms, and I tend to do wide EQ moves when I'm cutting out the low end out of my vocals. On the other hand, I may use a narrow EQ boost on 200 Hertz on a snare drum to get more thump out of it, or I might do a narrow boost at 5K on a kick drum to get more click out of it. There are no set in stone rules, just experiment for yourself and see what sounds best. Number 8, we have subtractive EQ. Subtractive EQ is used to clean up the mess that you don't want in your mix. This can be things such as masking frequencies, harsh frequencies, frequencies that aren't contributing to the mix, or any frequencies that you just don't want to have in your mix. I tend to do subtractive EQ first and then boosting EQ later, but this is not always the case, so don't take that as a set in stone rule. Number 9, we have room EQ. This is basically using EQ to overcome your room's acoustic shortcomings. I actually had to do this all the time when I was doing live sound, doing different EQ changes to make up for the different frequencies that would ring and resonate in different rooms, and this is actually also true for the studio environment. In fact, using corrective EQ can definitely help with the monitoring accuracy of your room, especially if you are dealing with an untreated room that doesn't sound very good. There's actually a company called SonarWorks that has a plugin that's supposed to do this really well for you called Sound ID Reference. Basically, this plugin has a database of a lot of the most popular speaker and headphone brands and the curve of those speakers and those headphones. And what it will do is it will make an EQ adjustment that basically compensates for whatever curve that your speakers and your headphones have, so that way you can get the flattest frequency response possible out of your headphones and your speakers. I've never used this plugin myself, but I definitely really want to have it, and I wanted to share it with you guys in case you want to pick it up, because my friend absolutely swears by it, and yeah, I definitely want to give this plugin a try. Number 10, we have monitor placement. Ideally, you'll be in an environment where everything is perfectly symmetrical and you won't get any weird frequency buildup or reflections. However, for most of us, that is not the case. For most of us, we are in bedrooms, closets, basements, garages, etc. And even though we are not really in the best environments, you still need to focus on trying to get the best speaker and monitor placement possible. Try to keep your speakers even on both sides and both equal distance away from you from where you're mixing. Also, try to keep them out of corners so that way you don't get as much frequency buildup, and try to keep them away from walls. If they do get close to the wall, at least try to treat the wall behind the speakers if you don't treat any other part of your room. Also, try to raise your speakers off of your table and onto monitor risers. This will prevent or reduce vibrations, and on top of that, it will raise the speakers a little bit higher and closer to the height of your head. So number 11, and possibly the most important tip on this list, is ear training. Honestly, ear training is probably the most important part about mixing, but it's also the hardest. There's absolutely nothing I can tell you that is going to make you hear better, but there are things that I can tell you as far as what to pay attention to and what to listen for. Ear training is going to take years of practice, and you're always going to be getting better and better and refining your hearing. Now, for me personally, I was a live sound engineer at some of the biggest clubs in downtown Nashville for about 5 years, and I was pretty much mixing something every single day of my life, on average about 5 days a week, 8 to 16 hours a day, so I definitely got my hours in. However, I do know that most people don't have that luxury, but I do have an exercise to help you out. If you want a simple exercise that you can start doing today to start mastering your ear training, then do this. Import tracks from any song of your choosing into a blank session, and then give a rough balance to these tracks. From there, add a parametric EQ onto every single one of these tracks. From here, give yourself only 15 seconds to EQ each track. You can do this in solo or not in solo. And basically, your goal is to listen to the track and immediately identify what needs to be changed, and be able to do that within a 15-second time frame. Once you get to the end of the tracks, then A/B all the EQs on and all the EQs off to see how it sounds before and after all your EQ changes. Spend about 30 minutes a day doing this exercise until you start to feel like you're able to make quick and effective EQ moves as soon as you hear a sound. If you'd like to learn more about this in detail, I actually created a video called The Ultimate EDM Mixing and Mastering Guide for Beginners, and this pretty much applies to any genre. I go over some core exercises to help you develop a strong foundation for yourself on your mixing and mastering journey. And if you want to go check this video out, I will leave a link somewhere here in the video for you to go check that out. There are also some really cool softwares out there that you can try if you want to practice your ear training, such as Golden Ears or Train Your Ears. Be sure to look into those if you are struggling with your ear training. Next, at number 12, we have frequency analyzers. Basically, you can use frequency analyzers to visualize the frequency content of your song. Now, I never tell anyone to mix with their eyes, but sometimes using a frequency analyzer can help you identify problem areas with the frequency spectrum in your mix. I still think frequency analyzers are hard to trust and that your ears are more accurate, but at least frequency analyzers will give you an idea of where your frequencies are setting. This can also potentially be helpful if you're a beginner and you don't have a sub, or you haven't really developed your ear yet to where you can hear the frequencies the way that you should. Definitely give this a try, but always trust your ears more than any kind of analyzer out there. Next, at number 13, we have dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ is great for dealing with frequencies that aren't necessarily a problem throughout the whole mix, but from time to time jump out and interrupt, ruin, or just kind of distract you from the rest of the song. The reason I would use dynamic EQ as opposed to regular EQ is perhaps maybe I don't want that frequency spectrum cut out of that particular element. I just want it brought down when it sticks out too much. For example, I actually tend to use dynamic EQ a lot on vocals because vocals tend to have frequencies that kind of come and go a lot throughout the performance. And when that happens, I want to tame the frequencies that are jumping out so that way I have a more even frequency spectrum throughout the mix. Now you can use dynamic EQ for a lot of things, but for wider frequency spectrums, I tend to use multiband compression, whereas for more narrow frequencies, I tend to use dynamic EQ. Number 14, we have EQ matching. So you can actually use EQ matching to help your mix match the tonal characteristics of a reference mix that you're wanting to kind of get the same frequency balance of. This is great for achieving a desired frequency curve from a song that you really like, but still be sure to use your ears and don't just trust the EQ to do all the work for you. Number 15, we have mid-side EQ. Mid-side EQ allows you to adjust the mid and the side channels separately for stereo shaping. This can be helpful for enhancing the stereo width on your tracks in a more natural but more subtle way than perhaps using something like a stereo widener. This can also be used to do things like carve out the low end frequencies from the sides so that way you can tighten up the low end in the middle, as well as carve out some middle frequencies to give something a more wide sound. Another way that I like to use mid-side EQ is on overheads. So for example, if I have a frequency that's just popping out on one side, a lot of the time I like to use mid-side EQ to get rid of that frequency on that one side. There are a lot of different ways than the ways that I've mentioned that you can use mid-side EQ. Just experiment with it and see what kind of tricks are out there on YouTube that people have tried with mid-side EQ and come up with some yourself. So for number 16, we have EQ automation. EQ automation can be used in a lot of ways to make your mix sound a lot more dynamic. For example, you can automate boosts or cuts throughout your mix to either make space for elements or to make certain elements pop at different points throughout your mix. You can also do things like automate a low cut on your kick drums that go too fast so that way you don't have that low end buildup when the kick speeds up. And you can also automate a low cut on your master for when you have buildups. Or perhaps you could even try automating an EQ boost during the hook on the vocals to make the vocals sound a little bit more bright when the hook comes in. There are a variety of different things that you can do with EQ automation. Just get creative and experiment, and you may just find that EQ automation becomes a big part of your mix game. For number 17, we have EQ presets. EQ presets can be used to save you time and ultimately help you be more creative and productive. Now I'm going to be honest, I don't use EQ presets very often, but recently my friend actually told me about this CLA snare preset on the Waves SSL right before I did a mix for a friend, and right after he told me about this preset, I actually tried it out on a snare drum, and it made the snare drum sound absolutely huge. In fact, that preset is literally what gave me the sound that I was going for on that mix, and I had never known about that until he told me. So from time to time, you may actually find that these presets really help you and completely transform your mix. So, don't be reluctant to give some of these EQ presets a try. Number 18 is A-Bing your EQ moves. Always A-B your EQ changes to make sure that the changes you made actually made the sound better and not worse. And especially be sure to do this if you are making EQ changes in solo, and be sure to A-B your EQ changes in context with the rest of the mix. Number 19, we have low end management. So pretty much be sure to cut low end frequencies out of pretty much anything where those low end frequencies are not serving your mix and are getting in the way of your kick and your bass. I've heard a lot of people here on YouTube say, cut the low end out of every single element that is not your kick and your bass, and I don't like to, say blanket rules like that, but generally speaking, any element that is not serving your low end frequency spectrum and is getting in the way of your kick and your bass definitely needs to have the low end frequency cut, because if it's not contributing to your mix, it's ultimately taking up headroom and getting in the way, even if you can't hear it. Also, make sure to carve out the EQ on your kick and your bass in such a way where the kick and the bass are working together, not getting in the way of each other or fighting each other. Next, at number 20, we're going to start talking about EQ moves to make on specific elements in the mix, and we're going to start with vocals. Slight boosts around 2 to 5K on vocals can add a little bit of clarity to your vocals, and boosts around 10K can add some air to your vocals. However, try to be cautious not to boost sibilance, because when you start boosting the top end on your vocals, you can definitely start increasing the sibilance of your S's. So be sure to, be aware of that and pay attention to that when doing high-end boosts on your vocals. Also recommend doing low cuts on your vocals, upwards of around 200 to maybe 300 hertz on your vocals, to get rid of any of that low end that isn't necessary. And then of course, if you feel like it needs it, don't be afraid to do a little bit of wide EQ cuts around the low mid frequencies on your vocals if your vocals are a little too boomy. And then of course, if you've got a little bit too much boxiness in your vocals, maybe you want to cut around the 500-ish hertz around the mid range, maybe 400 to 800 range, things like that. Of course, always use your ears, but these are the frequency spectrums that tend to kind of be the problem frequencies in vocals. Next up at number 21, we have drum EQ. Like I've said before, I don't like to give set rules for EQ because every song is different, but I will share with you what I tend to do on drums most of the time. For kicks, I tend to scoop the mids and boost a little bit of 60 hertz to get more thump, and boost around 5K to get more click, depending on the genre. For snares, I tend to do a low cut up to right below 200 hertz and then give a little bit of a boost around 200 hertz to get some of that snare thump, scoop the mids a little bit, and then boost around 5K again to get some more of that attack on the snare drum. Now these upper end boosts on the drums tend to be a little bit more wide Q boost instead of narrow Q boosts. And from time to time, when you boost that 200 hertz, I find that a lot of the time there is a frequency around 250 to 300 hertz that tends to pop up and just be a little too ringy. So a lot of the time I end up doing a little cut there on the snare as well, a very narrow EQ notch filter. For toms, I tend to scoop the mids, cut the sub lows, and then boost around 8K for some of that nice clickiness, so that way the toms can cut through the mix whenever they come in. For hi-hats and cymbals, I tend to use a low cut, which usually goes upwards into the mid-range to get rid of all those low-end frequencies and any mid-range stuff that I don't want in my hi-hats and my cymbals. And then I use a notch EQ to get rid of any harsh frequencies that tend to live a lot of the time around that 2 to 4K range. And then a lot of the time I'll add a little bit of air around 10K to give those cymbals that nice air, that nice sizzle that those cymbals really sound good with. And with overheads and rooms, they tend to get a different EQ curve pretty much every single time based off of how they were recorded, what resonant frequencies they have, and how they fit in with the rest of the drum mix. However, a lot of the time with rooms and overheads, I still find myself cutting out some of those low-end frequencies that would get in the way of the kick and the bass, as well as maybe scooping out a little bit of mid-range to get rid of some of that boxiness, and of course any harshness that the cymbals might be producing in the overheads and the rooms. And from there, at that point, it tends to kind of be whatever needs to be done to get them to fit appropriately in the mix. So guitars tend to be pretty much different every single time. Some guitars are more top end heavy, other ones have more mid-range, other ones are more boomy in the low end, other ones are more thin. So it's really hard to give you a typical approach to my guitar EQ. However, some tips that I have for you when EQing guitar are, if you have harsh guitars, then the frequencies that are harsh and are probably going to be bothering you tend to be around the 2 to 4K range. You can usually add air or brightness to dull guitars by boosting a wide Q at around 5 to 10K. If you have guitars with a lot of amp hiss, this can potentially get in the way of your cymbals and other high-end frequency elements within your mix. And to get rid of these, you can use a low cut, sometimes down to as low as 10K, to tame these frequencies and give yourself more headroom and more clarity in that frequency range. And using low cuts up to around 200 hertz can make space for your kick drum and your bass guitar. Again, these are not set in stone rules, always use your ears, but this should give you a pretty good idea of what to listen for next time you're dealing with guitars. Moving on to number 23, we have bass EQ. Now, how you EQ the bass is going to heavily depend on what genre you're mixing. For example, if you are mixing country music, then you probably want a pretty warm, low-end bass with not a whole lot of top end. But if you're mixing metal, for example, then you're probably gonna want quite a bit of top end, such as that 2K range to get that nice metal clank. Another thing you're going to want to decide when EQing your bass is whether or not this is a kick above or kick below the bass kind of mix. And sometimes this decision is pretty much made for you based off of the style of production, but sometimes you get the opportunity to make that choice for yourself. Now for me personally, most of my mixes have the kick below the bass, and the reason for this is because the kick drum tends to have a lower fundamental frequency around 60 hertz, where the bass tends to live a little bit higher around 100 to 200 hertz. However, this is not always the case. Some songs are structured quite a bit different, and the kick drum is a little bit higher pitched, whereas the bass is really rocking the low end more so than the kick drum. Songs with faster kicks tend to have the kick above the bass because if you have really fast kicks with a lot of low end coming in, it can be a little bit too much, whereas songs with slower kick drums tend to have the kick below the bass. However, again, this is not always the case, but this is how it tends to work a lot of the time. Basically, what you need to think about when EQing your bass is the top end contributing to your mix or is it taking away from your mix? Is this a kick above or below the bass kind of mix? And is the kick and the bass working together and kind of have their own space and aren't clashing with each other? Tip number 24, we have cymbal clarity. With cymbals, I would get rid of any lows and low mid frequencies that are just not necessary and not really a part of the hi-hat and cymbal sound. On hi-hats and cymbals, that can sometimes be a pretty high low cut, upwards of close to 1K at times. And of course, cymbals also tend to benefit from a nice boost around that 10K range, so that way you get that nice hi-hat sizzle, that nice air that adds to the top end frequencies, and sometimes even some cuts around the harsh frequencies like 2 to 4K if there's any harshness in your cymbals or your hi-hats. Moving on to number 25, we have parallel EQ. Parallel EQ can be used whenever you want to add frequencies to an element, but you don't want to compromise the original sound. To be honest, for me personally, I almost never use this, but this can be really cool on elements like vocals or guitars. Just experiment with it and see if you like it. I know some people really like to do this, but for me, it's just not a normal part of my workflow. Next up, we have master bus EQ. Master bus EQ is the process of EQing on your master bus, which ultimately affects your entire mix. And I actually do this quite often whenever I hear a frequency that's bothering me in the whole mix. You see, what I'll do is I'll actually cut it out on the master so that way I don't have to go through the mix and make that same cut on all the individual tracks, and this ultimately saves me time and is part of my top-down mixing method. And a lot of the time I'll boost top end for clarity, boost mid-range for fullness, and boost low end so I get more thump in my overall mix. And when EQing on your master, I highly recommend that you keep your changes subtle and you don't do more than maybe a 3 dB change at max, many cases not even that much. And when you are doing EQ changes on the master, use linear phase so that way you don't destroy the phase on your master. And even then, be subtle with your EQ changes, because even using linear phase, you can introduce pre-ringing if you do too much EQ on your master. Tip number 27 is phase coherence. When EQing multiple microphones that were used on the same source, be cautious of the phase coherency of those recordings. This is most common on drum recordings, but this can also be a problem on guitar amps that have multiple mics on them, or any other instrument where you're using multiple mics to record one source. Using drums as an example, keep in mind that every single mic on that drum kit picked up every other piece of that drum kit in the background, but all at different times. For example, the snare and the overhead mics both picked up the snare drum in the recording, but the overheads actually picked up the snare later than the snare mic did because the overhead mics were further away from the snare drum than the snare mic was. And this slight difference can cause phase issues with your snare mic and your overhead mics. Now, assuming that your snare mic and your overhead mics are actually in phase, over EQing your overheads or your snare can actually introduce phase issues. An easy way to identify if this is actually an issue is just to use the phase flip button on the snare drum with the overheads playing and see if the snare gets quieter or if the snare gets louder or if it sounds fuller or thinner than it did before you hit that phase flip button. If it sounds worse when you hit the phase flip button, then it was in phase before you hit it, and if it sounds better, then it was out of phase before you hit it. This is just one example, but just be aware of EQing microphones that were all used to record one source. Moving on to number 28 is EQ before and after compression. Now, there is no right or wrong way. Both ways have their own sound, and both are worth experimenting with to see which one you like better. So let's break down the effects of each one. For example, compression after an EQ can potentially emphasize the EQ changes that you made before the compressor as well as tame them. However, if you have a compressor set on your track and it sounds right, and then you put an EQ before that compressor and you start boosting frequencies, then you're going to start pushing more frequency information into that compressor, and now the compressor is going to start compressing harder. And the same is true if you start EQing and pulling frequencies out. You're going to reduce the frequency information going into that compressor, which means now that element is not going to be hitting the compressor as hard as it was before you did that EQ. On the other hand, adding an EQ after your compressor and boosting some frequencies can potentially reduce some of that compression sound, which might actually be your goal if you like the compression, but you want it to sound a little bit less compressed and you want a certain frequency spectrum to be boosted and you want to keep some of that compression color. Another reason that you might want to add an EQ after a compressor is because you don't want those frequencies that you're boosting to get compressed by the compressor, or maybe you want to remove some frequencies that compressor brought up and you don't want it to affect the compression levels. Point is, there's different reasons to use both and they both have their own sound, so just experiment and see what you like best. Moving on to number 29, we have linear phase EQ. Basically, you use linear phase to avoid causing any phase issues when EQing. Now, I don't know all the nerdy stuff behind linear phase EQ, but I do know that you want to use it so that way you don't compromise the phase when you're EQing. And of course, this is most useful when EQing your masters so that way you don't compromise the phase when phase is the most crucial. But there are other situations where you may want to experiment with linear phase EQ, such as on your drum mics, or like we were talking about earlier, anything that's mic'd up with multiple mics where you don't want to have phase issues. Just keep in mind to use linear phase or use an EQ with a linear phase mode whenever you want to EQ without compromising the phase. For number 30, we have group bus EQ. If your goal is to shape the overall sound of multiple elements at once, then group bus EQ is going to be the best way you can do this. This is going to sound best on things like vocals, drums, guitars, but it can also sound good on other elements as well. Just experiment and try to see what you like best. And group bus EQ is part of top-down mixing, just like mastering, and this will allow you to save a lot more time and make bigger changes on the buses so that way you don't have to make as many small changes on each individual track within that group. This will ultimately help you save time, but this will also help you create more coherency between all of your elements within that group. Moving on to tip number 31, we have DeEssing. Now, DeEssing is basically a dynamic EQ used to target S's specifically on the frequency spectrum. This is great for using on vocals, but this can actually be used on other instruments that have top-end frequencies that are popping out that you need to tame very easily and very quickly. Moving on to number 32, we have dynamic sidechain EQ. Basically what this is used for is to duck the frequency range on one element when another element comes into the mix. This tends to be used when you have two elements that have a similar frequency spectrum and then they kind of clash with each other and you need to make space for one over the other, but you don't want to change the frequency curve of either element. You just want one element to kind of get out of the way when the other element comes into the mix. Now, for me personally, I don't tend to opt for dynamic sidechain EQ as much as I tend to opt for dynamic sidechain compression, but they are basically the same thing. Times that you may want to use this is when you have your kick drum come in and you want your bass to kind of get out of the way when the kick drum comes in and have it duck every time the kick hits. Or another example might be when your vocals come in. If the guitars are in the way, you want the guitars to kind of get out of the way for your vocals. So you sidechain some dynamic EQ to help duck some of those frequencies that are getting in the way of your vocals every time the vocals come in on the guitars. Of course, in these situations, sidechain compression or sidechain multiband compression are also great options and tend to be what I prefer to use as opposed to dynamic EQ. But if you prefer to use dynamic EQ, please let me know in the comments and let me know why you like that more as opposed to multiband compression or regular compression, because I'd love to hear about it and learn something. Moving on to number 33, we have fundamental frequencies. Fundamental frequencies exist in everything, but in drums they are especially important. So kick drums tend to have a fundamental frequency around 60 Hertz, snares tend to have a fundamental frequency around 200 Hertz, toms tend to have a fundamental frequency around the lows to low mid frequency spectrum, and so forth. And these fundamental frequencies will always have harmonics, which will always be exact doubles of the fundamental frequency. For example, if a snare has a fundamental frequency at 200 Hertz, then it will also have a fundamental frequency at 400 Hertz and 800 Hertz and so on. This is also helpful knowledge when doing notch EQ, because if 500 Hertz, for example, is bugging you on an instrument, then there is a good chance that 1K will also be bothering you on that same instrument. Of course, this is not always the case, but it is a cool thing to know and to be aware of. And moving on to number 34, we have color EQ versus transparent EQ. There are all sorts of different types of EQ, but most of them fall into one of two categories: colorful EQ or transparent EQs. Many vintage EQs that are modeled after analog gear are colorful EQs, whereas many parametric and graphic EQs tend to be more transparent. Colorful EQ tends to be better for boosting and adding nice frequencies to an element, whereas transparent EQ tends to be better at cutting frequencies more so than boosting. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't cut with a colorful EQ or that you can't boost with a transparent EQ, but this tends to be what sounds best most of the time depending on your goals. An example of a colorful EQ would be something like the SSL Waves Channel Strip EQ, and an example of a transparent EQ would be something like the Pro Q3 from FabFilter. There are many examples out there, but these are currently my two favorites, and I highly recommend you give them a shot. So those are my 34 EQ and frequency tips. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then I think you'll also enjoy the 26 things that I wish I knew before I started mixing and mastering. I'll leave a link to that somewhere here in the video. And of course, before this video comes to an end, I wanted to mention one more time my free resource, The Essentials Guide to Becoming a Beast at Mixing and Mastering. I put this free resource together so that way you can develop a strong foundation for yourself on your mixing and mastering journey. And if you want to pick this up, you can do so by clicking the link in the description of this video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, drop a comment, and share this with someone who can gain some value from it. And I will see you guys next week. Peace.